The night is falling. The world outside is falling silent. And in that silence, we turn our thoughts not to the great battles of history, nor to the rulers who carved their names in stone. Instead, we wander to something simpler, gentler, and generally more mundane. Greetings, my friends. Tonight we return to ancient Greece, not to its philosophers in marble courtyards or its poets who recited poetry under olive trees. No, our path avoids the noise of amphitheaters and the bustle of crowded markets. Instead, we walk to the steady rhythm of everyday life, to the quiet act of collecting water. Imagine a small Greek town nestled between hills where the air smells faintly of dust and time. The houses are simple, their plastered stone walls stained by the sun. The streets are narrow, sometimes shaded by overhanging balconies where vines curl lazily toward the light. The soundscape here is leisurely. The cooing of pigeons on the roof, the occasional barking of a dog, the soft murmur of women talking to each other as they pass by. Water is needed in every home. For drinking, for cooking, for washing, for cooling the body in the summer heat. But water is not piped through walls as it is today. Instead, it waits elsewhere, collected in fountains or drawn from deep wells, carried home in jugs carefully balanced on shoulders. Every day, people make the same journey. It is a journey not of choice, but of necessity. And yet, it has its own rhythm, its own sense of time. Imagine the women in the house waking up before the day gets too warm. They rise with familiar movements, picking up tall amphorae, their clay surfaces smooth and cool in the morning shade. With these jars in their hands, or balanced on their hips, they step out into the streets of their city. Their sandals press lightly into the dust. Their voices float in conversation, a thread of human sound weaving through the stillness of dawn. So, as you immerse yourself in the silence of this evening, allow yourself to walk peacefully through those sunny streets of long ago. Watch the shadows of the olive trees dance gently on the whitewashed walls. Hear the laughter of children faintly heard in a side alley. Smell the faint scent of wild herbs carried by the breeze. And above all, feel the quiet rhythm of a task that has been repeated day after day, shaping the pace of an entire life. Let us walk together into it, slowly, gently, step by step. And when the story closes, as always, I ask that you do not forget. If you find comfort in these quiet wanderings through the past, please subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. This is the story of water collection in ancient Greece. A story of amphorae, wells, fountains, and footsteps. A story of lives measured not in grand events, but in quiet moments. The first light of the sun rose slowly over the hills of Attica, slipping through the thin mist that clung to the folds of the land like a blanket not yet ready to be cast aside. Soft beams of gold stretched out across a small village nestled between silver-green olive groves and scrubby fig trees. The village had no name you would know, and perhaps it never did. It was simply home to those who lived there. In the distance, a cock crowed once, then again. Not sharply, not in a hurry, more a long, lingering sound. The stone houses of the village, made of mud brick and roofed with rounded terracotta tiles, remained quiet. Some of the wooden shutters creaked open slowly. Others waited. The day would be warm, as so many were, and there was no need to rush. A young girl stirred beneath a rough linen blanket. Her name was Thalia. Her family lived in a simple home at the edge of the village, near the slope that led to the olive groves. Thalia blinked against the sunlight, filtering through the doorway, and listened. There was the low buzz of insects, the coo of doves roosting in the eaves, and, just barely, the faint plip-plip of water dripping from the communal cistern beside the well. Water, after all, was the first thought of the day. As always, Thaleia sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Her feet touched the cool clay floor. The walls around her were smoothed with lime, and the faint scent of hearth smoke still lingered. Her mother had already risen. A folded cloth, a small jar, and a wide-mouthed pot waited near the door. It was time for the morning collection. The well, the heart of the village, was not far, just past the old fig tree and the baked path that meandered between goat pens and herb gardens. Thaleia carried the pot carefully, one hand underneath for balance, her steps measured and calm. She had done this many times before. The terracotta vessel was painted with faded designs, a curling vine, a row of dots, the faint outline of a bird. It had belonged to her grandmother, and possibly her grandmother before that. Slightly chipped, but sound. It held about 3 koti lai, enough for the morning meal and washing. More would be needed later. As she walked, the sun rose a little higher, brushing the tops of the olive trees with golden light. Bees danced lazily among wild thyme. The earth under her sandals was warm already. And at the center of the village, as always, was the well. The village well was simple in its construction, but central to life. It was a circular stone structure built waist-high, with a flat coping of polished limestone worn smooth by countless hands. Around it, a low wall formed a shaded place where pots could be set down, conversations could unfold, and the labor of water collection could take on its unhurried rhythm. The well was not deep by city standards, but it was dependable, fed by a spring that trickled from an underground seam of limestone. It gave clear, cool water year-round. The villagers had long ago placed a simple pulley and rope system above it, a worn wooden spindle and a loop of thick flax rope, smooth from decades of use. The bucket was made of bronze, dented and patched, but it held well. Thaleia approached as others were already gathering. The women came in the early hours, some young like herself, others older, wrapped in soft woolen shawls, their hair pinned back with olive wood sticks. They carried pots of every size, large amphorae with narrow necks, smaller hextriae with 3 handles for easier lifting. They greeted one another not with loud exclamations, but with nods and murmured words. "Calimera," Thaleia said softly to her neighbor, Meliso, who was kneeling by the coping, tying a cloth around her jar's mouth to keep insects away. "Calimera, child," the older woman replied. "Early today." Thaleia smiled faintly and placed her vessel beside the others. One by one, they waited their turn. The bucket dipped and rose with a soft creak. Water splashed gently as it was poured into waiting pots. The sound was soothing, like a slow, steady breath. They did not speak loudly here. The well was considered a sacred place, not a temple, but a place of quiet respect. Some even left offerings nearby, sprigs of laurel, a few olives, the occasional small clay figurine placed among the stones. As Thaleia waited, she listened. The low voices blended with the hum of cicadas, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the steady drip of water from the bucket's edge. There was something ancient and comforting in the routine, as if each day slipped into the next without resistance, like water poured from one vessel into another. When her turn came, she stepped forward slowly, helped by Meliso. Together, they lifted the bucket and poured it carefully. The cool water made a satisfying sound as it filled the pot. The terracotta darkened slightly as it absorbed the moisture. She thanked the well with a touch of her hand to the rim. Not a ritual exactly, but something like it. Then wrapped the top with cloth, tied it, and lifted the vessel in both arms. The weight was manageable for now. She turned to walk back through the olive trees, where the sunlight filtered gently through the branches and the day continued as slowly as it had begun. Back at home, the pot she had just filled joined others in a row along the shaded wall. Each had its place, each had its purpose. Some were for cooking, others for storage. A few, like the hydria she carried that morning, were for carrying water. Water was not just fetched. It was preserved, stored, and kept cool. And the pots that held it were more than just containers. They were the result of care, skill, and the works of another kind of quiet rhythm, the potter's craft. Later that morning, once the kitchen fire was kindled and the bread left to rise, Thaleia walked with her uncle, Nikias, to the outskirts of the village. There, near a dusty bend in the path, stood the potter's workshop. It was little more than a shed with open sides and a packed earth floor, but it held everything it needed. A turntable made of stone, balanced on a wooden pivot, piles of reddish clay from the nearby riverbed, tools made of bone, horn, and shell, and, of course, the kiln, a dome of stone and brick, scorched black inside, smelling faintly of ash and earth. The potter Dorias was already at work. He did not look up immediately. His hands were wet with clay, shaping a new vessel. The wheel turned slowly under his foot. The shape rose like a column from the center, smooth, spiraling, alive. Another for the water, perhaps, he murmured without looking. Or oil. We shall see. He spoke softly, more to himself than to them. Thaleia watched the process unfold. It was quiet, deliberate. The potter's fingers pinched, smoothed, and guided. The walls of the pot grew evenly, their surface catching the light like polished skin. He used a damp cloth to shape the rim, then etched a pattern around the neck. Nothing elaborate, just a line of meanders and dots. When the shape was right, he lifted the vessel with care and set it in the drying area beneath a linen cloth. Later, once hardened, it would be fired. First low and smoky, then hot and fast. The kiln would glow red-orange, and the air would smell of burnt clay and smoke. Every pot bore the signature of its birth. Faint rings from the wheel, a warp in the glaze, a fingerprint pressed unknowingly beneath the rim. These imperfections were not flaws. They were memory. The pots would hold water, wine, oil, and stories. And like the women at the well, they would carry their burdens with quiet grace. By midday, the sun stood high and warm. Shadows curled under the eaves of homes, and the cicadas sang louder in the heat. In the kitchen, Thaleia's mother ladled water from the morning pot into a shallow basin. She added a sprig of mint and a slice of dried fig, letting it steep in the shade. Lunch was simple: barley bread, olives, and soft cheese wrapped in fig leaves. But before they ate, they sat in the courtyard and washed their hands slowly, one after the other, dipping fingers into the cool water and letting it fall onto the thirsty earth below. The water was never wasted. What was poured out helped nourish the plants, cooled the dust, gave comfort to the roots of the lemon tree that grew in the corner of their yard. After eating, the family rested. Thaleia lay on a woven mat beneath the tree, eyes half closed. The light flickered above her, filtered through swaying leaves. She could hear, very faintly, The sound of someone filling a pot at the well again, a second trip perhaps, or a new arrival. The creak of the pulley, the splash, the murmur of a voice. It was like a lullaby. The water once again moving from earth to hand, from bucket to jar, from well to home. Even in rest, the rhythm of water collection continued, slow, steady, and serene. It was the heartbeat of the village, and it never stopped. Not every home in the village relied solely on the communal well. Some, especially those at the edges of the settlement, closer to the rocky hills and the gnarled roots of wild olives, made the slow journey to the spring itself. A place older than the village, nestled in a small, shaded hollow where water seeped, quietly and perpetually, from the limestone rock. Thalia had heard of the spring many times, but she rarely visited. Today, however, her aunt had asked for her help. The larger storage jar had cracked, not badly, but enough to leak, and the well was busier than usual. So they would walk together to the spring, early enough to beat the heat, late enough to enjoy the silence. The path was narrow and dusty, winding between low stone walls that hemmed in groves of olives and capers. Lizards darted from rock to rock. Bees hovered near thistle blooms. In the distance, the faint bleating of goats. Her aunt, a quiet woman named Ione, balanced a larger vessel on her hip with the grace of long practice. Thalia carried a smaller jar, just enough for a light refill. They walked slowly. No one hurried in such heat. The cicadas had already begun their midday chorus, though in the shade it was cooler. A breath of breeze among the pine needles, a whisper of relief. As they approached the spring, the sounds of the village fell away. There, hidden between two outcroppings of stone and surrounded by ferns and moss, was the source, a slow trickle from the rock wall into a shallow pool, edged by flat stones polished smooth by generations of feet and jars. Someone had carved a small niche into the rock above, where a clay figure of a nymph, worn smooth, her features almost faded, sat half-sheltered by lichen. A few offerings had been placed before her, a loop of braided grass, a piece of dried honeycomb, a coin green with age. The spring was not a place for chatter. It was a place to kneel quietly, to fill one's jar slowly, and to thank the earth without words. Ione and Thalia did just that. The water was cool and clear, flowing gently, predictably. They filled their pots in silence and sat a moment on the stones, resting in the stillness. From here, the view stretched wide. Hills rolling off into haze, olive trees nodding in the breeze, the distant white smudge of another village across the valley. The same rituals, repeated there too. Other girls, other jars, other springs. Nothing urgent, nothing new. Only time and water. In the dry months, the long sun-filled stretch from Thargelion to Metagitnion, the village grew quieter still. The fields hardened, the hills shimmered with heat, and even the insects moved more slowly. Water was carefully rationed, more carefully than usual. Every pot counted. Every drop mattered. Some homes had built rain jars, large pithoi sunk halfway into the earth, wide-mouthed and dark inside, covered with wooden lids or thick cloths to keep the water cool. They were filled in the springtime, when rains were heavier and roofs channeled water into troughs that led to these storage vessels. But summer meant no rain, and so the villagers relied on what they had stored, what they could carry, and what they could carefully conserve. Thalia's grandfather tended one such jar, kept beneath the overhang near the back of the house. It was an old vessel, patched in places with pitch, its rim lined with cloth to strain debris. He was a careful man, quiet by nature, his movements deliberate and slow. In the morning, he would lift the lid, check the level of the water, and whisper a kind of greeting, not prayer, but habit. He showed Thalia once how he checked for clarity, dipping a shallow cup and holding it to the light. If the water shone clean, it was good. If not, they would boil it in a bronze kettle, slowly, over the coals. "Not all water is equal," he said softly, "but all water is sacred." Some homes also had shallow stone basins carved into the earth. These were used for washing, not bathing, but rinsing vegetables, cleaning fabrics, watering animals. The gray water flowed down narrow runnels to gardens and fig trees, or seeped into the dusty soil to cool the roots of vines. Children were taught not to splash, not to play carelessly. But still, in the quietest moments, one could hear them giggling by the troughs, dipping fingers, chasing dragonflies. Thalia watched from the shade, her own jar beside her. The surface of the water shimmered softly, catching the light like glass. A bee hovered near the rim, then flew on. Even stillness has its sound. Evenings at the well were different from mornings. In the early hours, the village was hushed, not asleep, but tender, like something just waking. The well echoed that mood. But in the evening, after the heat had passed, after the chores were done and the fields gone golden with shadow, the well became something more. A meeting place, a space of shared breath and quiet stories. Thalia often accompanied her mother for the evening collection, though they didn't always need more water. Sometimes the pot was only half empty. But the ritual was as much about presence as necessity. The light was softer, slanting sideways through the trees. Birds rustled in their nests. Goats were herded home. Bread cooled on stone shelves, the smell of smoke and herbs rising gently from open windows. At the well, women gathered again. Fewer than in the morning, but more talkative. They carried their pots with less urgency. Some sat on the low wall, weaving. Others leaned against the fig tree, laughing softly. A girl hummed a tune as she waited for the bucket to rise. There were no loud voices. Even laughter was gentle here. Until they spoke of small things, a hen gone broody, a cousin visiting from another village, a new dye tried for wool. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy. The pulley creaked, water splashed, cicadas clicked softly in the background. A young woman named Danai dipped her fingers into her jar and touched them to her forehead. "Still cool," she murmured. "The pot's a good one." "It's the clay," her aunt replied. "From the southern bank. That soil holds the chill." And then a pause, and someone remembered a story. A tale of a woman whose jar never emptied, blessed by a river god, or perhaps a trick of clever refilling. They laughed gently, each imagining the endless pot, not as miracle, but as comfort. Thalia's mother filled their jar, tied it with cloth, and rested it beside her feet. She did not rise to leave right away. Instead, she let the quiet of the place linger around them like a shawl. The sun dipped behind the hill. Another day, another jar. And still, the water flowed. At night, the village did not sleep all at once. Some doors remained open to the breeze. Some lamps stayed lit longer. And the water, silent, ever-present, continued its slow work in clay and root and stone. Thalia lay beneath her thin blanket, the air still warm from the day. The water jar stood near the doorway, its surface slightly damp. In the hush of the night, she could hear a faint sound, the slow tick of droplets cooling the exterior, a tiny rivulet finding its way down the side. The clay walls of the house held the scent of the day. Olive wood smoke, sun-warmed linen, time. And always, water. She closed her eyes and listened. There was the soft hoot of an owl in the grove, the whisper of a moth brushing a hanging cloth. Far off, someone's voice, low and drifting. Perhaps a lullaby, perhaps only a dream. The house creaked gently in the cooling air. Somewhere, a pot shifted, clay against clay, a rounded echo like a pebble in a stream. In the corner, her father stirred the coals of the hearth, not to cook, but to bank the fire for the morning. A small cup of water stood beside him, steam rising faintly as he poured it onto the ashes. The sound, hiss, then silence. She remembered then a story her grandmother had once told, that the gods of springs and rivers wandered at night, invisible to most, blessing homes where water was honored and well used. She imagined a pale figure stepping softly between the houses, pausing by the well, brushing a hand across a sleeping jar. It was only a story, but she liked it. She rolled onto her side and felt the cool of the floor beneath her hand. Not cold, just cool, like water in the shade. Outside, the cicadas had grown quiet. The olive trees whispered. And somewhere, faint and distant, a stream ran down a rocky hill, murmuring to itself as it had for 1,000 years. Sleep came like water poured slowly into a bowl. Some days, when the village well ran slower than usual, or when the spring seemed less generous, the people took to the river. It was not near, a good walk past the southern olive groves, beyond the dry terraces and the barley fields, where the trees gave way to stones and sun-split grass. But the river was wide, slow, and sure. Its waters came down from the mountains, far beyond the hills, carrying with it the dust of old myths and melted snow. Thalea's uncle made the journey once a week, pulling a small cart with larger amphorae nestled in straw. On one such morning, she joined him. They set off before dawn. The sky was faintly blue, the stars retreating quietly behind the light. The clay paths were still cool beneath their feet. The air was clean, almost sweet, with the scent of fennel and sage. The road passed a shepherd's hut, a stand of cypress trees, and a shrine to Hermes, where travelers placed pebbles and bits of string. They stopped to leave a sprig of rosemary, out of custom, not belief. By the time they reached the river, the sun had cleared the ridge and the water shone like glass. Wide, slow-moving, edged with reeds and willows, the river made no sound at all, but for the occasional ripple stirred by a breeze or a turtle slipping from a rock. They filled their amphorae carefully, first rinsing them in the shallows, then submerging them just so. The river water was different from the well. It carried the scent of distance, of silt and leaf. Not bad, just unfamiliar. It would be boiled at home, filtered through linen and charcoal, and then stored with care. Others came to the river too. Farmers with donkeys, women in pairs, older men who moved slowly but steadily. No one rushed. The river would not change pace for anyone. Once filled, they rested beneath a tamarisk tree, its fronds whispering above. Thalea drank from a shallow cup carved from horn and watched a pair of ducks make lazy circles near the reeds. The sun warmed her back. The river flowed on. Later, when the pots were loaded and tied, they began the return walk. The road to the river was long, but it was old. It knew every footfall, every wheel rut. And though the jars were heavy, the rhythm of the cart and the sound of the water sloshing inside was familiar, almost musical. Home was waiting. And there, the river water would find its place among the others. One jar among many, in a quiet village with no name, where water always mattered. As summer deepened, the days grew longer, and the potter worked late into the evenings. Firing clay was best done after dusk, when the air cooled and the fire's heat could rise undisturbed. Thaleia had watched from afar, but tonight she was invited closer. The kiln stood like a dome of sleeping stone behind the potter's shed. During the day it looked unimpressive, cracked and soot-streaked. But by night, when the fire was lit and the mouth glowed like the inside of a lamp, it became something else. A hearth for the earth itself. Inside, rows of newly shaped pots rested, stacked carefully around the fire pit, their surfaces dull and dusty. Some bore intricate painted lines, stylized fish, vines, or spirals. Others were plain, their form enough. Doreus, the potter, moved slowly and without hurry. He tended the fire like a gardener tends a vine, feeding it just enough, then stepping back. The flames licked at the roof of the kiln and retreated again. The air shimmered with heat. Sparks drifted upward like fireflies. Thaleia sat nearby, legs tucked under her, watching. "This one's for water," he said, pointing to a wide-bellied jar with a reinforced rim. She asked for a cool one, said her roof catches the first heat. He meant Danai, from the far end of the village. He turned another slowly. "This one will be yours, smaller for walking." The fire snapped. Clay clicked faintly as it hardened. Pottery was not just craft, he reminded her. It was time made visible, earth shaped by hand, dried by air, and set by fire. The same elements as life itself. As the flame settled into a steady rhythm, he reached into a small jar and scattered a few dried olive leaves into the kiln. They hissed and danced, then vanished. "For scent," he said simply. "For thanks." They sat in silence as the moon rose and the fire held steady. Far off, the cicadas sang a softer song. The heat radiated outward, slow and constant. When the fire had done its work, the pots would cool slowly overnight, and in the morning they would be carried, carefully, reverently, to homes that would fill them with water and with life. In a grove at the edge of the village, shaded by tall oaks and a single laurel tree, stood a shallow stone altar. It was not a temple. No priests lived here, no columns, no grandeur. Just a weathered platform, a few stones, and the faint smell of damp moss. But here, once each month, the villagers brought offerings, not just for the gods, but for the water itself. Thaleia came with her mother, carrying a small jar filled with spring water and a wreath made of rosemary and dried lavender. Around them, others gathered slowly. There was no ceremony, no chant, only the placement of items: a few olives, a loaf of barley bread, a ribbon, a coin. One woman poured a little water onto the stones. Another touched her hand to her lips and placed it on the bark of the laurel. It was not worship in the way the city might understand. It was closer to a habit of respect, a reminder that the water was not only useful, but meaningful. That it came from the earth, not from demand. Some said a nymph lived in the roots of the trees. Others said it was simply tradition. Thaleia didn't need to know. The stillness of the place was enough. She poured her water slowly onto the base of the stone and laid her wreath beside it. No one spoke loudly. Children were hushed. Even the goats grazing nearby seemed to pause. And when they left, they did so slowly, following the same worn path back through the olives, their jars still empty, but hearts quietly full. Back home, the water from the well tasted the same, but felt different. One evening, not long after the festival of Cronia, Thalia carried her jar home from the well for the 1000th time. She walked as always, carefully, but without strain. The path was familiar, the trees the same. A breeze stirred the tall grass. The water in her jar shifted gently with each step. At the house, she set it down near the doorway and sat beside it, watching the sky turn orange behind the hills. Her hands rested on her knees. Her breath slowed. The water inside the jar was still, clear, cool. In it, she saw the shape of the trees above, the flutter of a moth's wings, the faint movement of clouds. She dipped her fingers in, as always, and traced a circle on her wrist. Tomorrow, she would return to the well. Next week, perhaps the spring. The pots would be used and reused, fired and broken, replaced and painted. Some would last, others would not. The rhythm of collection would continue, carried forward by new hands, new names, in new seasons. But tonight, the water was enough, and the jar, silent and round and full of the sky, waited patiently by the wall, just as it always had.